The first morning, we thought nothing of it. Just another oddity in the woods, something easily explained away. But by the third, when the footprints started to appear again, no one had come near our tents, we began to understand that something else was happening. We'd chosen the spot because of its remoteness. A small, secluded lake tucked between thick trees, away from any roads, far enough out that we figured it would be safe from prying eyes, from anyone who might ruin our escape from the world. 4 of us, me, Rachel, James, and Sarah. We'd packed light, just a few essentials, and we settled in for what was supposed to be a quiet few days of fishing, drinking, and talking about everything and nothing at all. A place where the world felt far away. The first night was peaceful. Too peaceful, I think, looking back. The wind didn't stir much. The moon hung low and silver in the sky, and the sound of the water lapping at the shore was the only thing we heard. We slept, all of us, under the stars as the crackling fire faded into embers. There was nothing unusual, nothing that would make us think twice until we woke the next morning. It was the footprints pressed deep into the dirt around our tents. Heavy, muddy impressions that circled our camp from one end of the site to the other, stopping just short of the fire pit. The prints weren't just regular footprints. They were strange. Too large to be any animal I knew, and yet they were too human to be some wild creature. There was a dragging mark, too, something that trailed behind each step, as though whatever was walking wasn't quite walking at all. It was more like it was dragging itself, slow, deliberate. We dismissed it. We were in the woods, after all. Things happen in the woods. Animals get curious, raccoons wander about. Maybe a deer or a boar had come by. But even as I told myself that, the gnawing feeling in my gut grew. A feeling that maybe we weren't alone after all. By the second night, the air had grown colder, the night stretching longer. The wind picked up a little, just enough to send the trees groaning. The lake, though, remained unnaturally still, as if it were holding its breath. We had all noticed the footprints again that morning. This time they were closer to our tents, closer to where we had slept. The dragging marks seemed to encircle our camp, like the thing was watching us, pacing. No one spoke of it, but we all felt it, the weight of it. That night we sat by the fire, too restless to sleep. The laughter had stopped being easy and started sounding more forced. The shadows between the trees seemed to grow longer, and I kept catching glimpses of movement just beyond the fire's light. But when I looked, there was nothing there. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks, but it didn't stop the cold feeling creeping up the back of my neck. Then came the third morning. When I stepped out of my tent, I froze. The footprints were there again, fresh, and this time they led directly into the water. Not just near the edge, but into the lake itself. The dragging marks were unmistakable, like something was being pulled, dragged through the mud into the cold, dark water. And it wasn't just one set of prints now, there were multiple crisscrossing over each other in the dirt, coming from all directions. It was as though the creature, whatever it was, had been circling us all night, waiting for something or someone. That was when we realized someone was missing. James. He wasn't in his tent, and his gear was gone. The fire pit, still smouldering from the night before, was untouched by his presence. It was as though he had simply vanished. The lake was eerily silent as I stood at the water's edge, staring into the black depths. I could feel the pull of it, that strange, oppressive weight in the air, like the lake was alive somehow, watching us. My heart hammered in my chest as I thought back to the dragging marks, the way they had led into the water. Could it have been him? Had he gone in on his own? But no, it didn't make sense. James wouldn't have wandered off in the middle of the night, not without a word, not without leaving some sign. The others started searching. We called his name over and over, but there was no answer. Only the hollow sound of our voices echoing across the water. We couldn't find a trace of him anywhere. Not along the shore, not in the woods, nowhere. It was like he had simply been swallowed up by the earth. We searched for hours. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the forest itself was pressing in on us. But then, as the sun began to set, Rachel's voice broke through the silence, shaky and trembling. She was pointing to the water, to the lake where the dragging marks had led. There, in the middle of the lake, was a shape, something moving beneath the surface. Something large, far too large to be a fish, swimming, no, dragging its way toward the center. I couldn't look. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, but I couldn't look either. I felt sick and my heart pounded in my chest, the taste of fear and salt in my mouth. I knew what it was. I knew what it had done. It had taken James. And now it was coming for the rest of us. The wind picked up again, the trees groaning louder now, and that's when I heard it, the sound. Just beneath the water, soft at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. A dragging sound, something heavy sliding across the lake bed, something moving in the water, something that wasn't quite human. I never saw what came out of the lake that night. But I didn't need to. By the time I turned and ran, the others were already gone. There was no point in calling their names. There was nothing left to say. I'm not sure what happened to them or why I was the only one who made it out, but I know this. When you camp by a secluded lake in the woods and you hear the dragging in the water at night, you don't get to leave. The lake takes what it wants. And once it has you, it keeps you. The first thing I noticed when we came back was the silence. The woods, usually alive with the chirps of crickets and the rustle of wind through the trees, were eerily still. It was the kind of silence that wasn't an absence of sound, but a presence all its own, dense, heavy, oppressive. We'd spent the day at the waterfall, a secluded little spot tucked deep in the forest. It had been idyllic, the kind of afternoon that makes you feel like you're in the middle of a postcard. Sunlight filtering through the trees, the water shockingly cold but refreshing, laughter echoing against the rocks. For a little while, it felt like nothing bad could ever touch us out there. But when we crested the ridge that led back to our campsite, that feeling evaporated like mist. Something was wrong. At first I couldn't put my finger on it. The fire pit looked intact and the clearing was just as we'd left it. But then my eyes landed on Sarah's tent, or what was left of it. The nylon was shredded, long slashes running down its sides like claw marks. The poles were bent, snapped in some places, and the rainfly had been torn clean off, hanging limply from a branch like a broken flag. It wasn't just her tent. Ben's tent was flattened, the fabric punctured and ripped to tatters. Our cooking supplies, which we'd neatly stacked by the fire pit, were scattered across the clearing. The cooler had been upended, its contents spilling out onto the ground, and the folding chairs were smashed into splinters. Even the logs we'd arranged for sitting had been tossed aside, as though something had rampaged through the camp with a mindless, violent fury. I could feel the others behind me, frozen in place, their breathing shallow and uneven. My own chest felt tight, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break a rib. There were no footprints, nothing to suggest who or what had done this, but those claw marks told a story all their own. They were deep, precise, and too large for any animal I could name. We didn't talk about it. There was no time for speculation, no room for denial. The unspoken understanding among us was clear. We had to leave, now. Grabbing what little we could salvage, a few rucksacks, a torch that miraculously still worked, and the clothes on our backs, we began to retreat, our movements hurried and clumsy. The sun was already sinking below the treetops, and the shadows stretched long and jagged across the forest floor, turning every branch and bush into something sinister. We were maybe a mile from camp when we heard it. The roar wasn't something you could describe, not properly anyway. It was deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, reverberating through the trees like a thunderclap. It wasn't a sound any human or animal should be able to make. It was ancient, primal, the kind of sound that speaks to something buried deep in your DNA, something that screams run, and run we did. Branches clawed at my face, roots snagged my feet, and the weight of the pack on my shoulders felt unbearable, but I didn't dare slow down. The others were ahead of me, their figures barely visible in the fading light, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. I didn't have to look back to know that whatever had made that sound was following us. I could feel it, a presence in the dark, closing the distance with every step. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trees blurring together into an endless maze of shadow and dread. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the fear was stronger than the pain. The roar came again, closer this time, so loud it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. We burst out of the tree line onto the gravel path that led back to the main road, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought we might make it. But then I heard a crash behind me, the sound of something massive tearing through the underbrush, and I knew we were out of time. We didn't stop running until we reached the cars. I don't even remember unlocking the doors or starting the engine. It was all a blur of motion and panic. As we sped down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the dark, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. Just a shape, massive and hunched, its eyes glowing faintly in the distance before the trees swallowed it whole. None of us spoke on the drive back to civilization. What was there to say? The forest had been alive with something we couldn't understand, something that didn't belong in the world we knew. And even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that we didn't really escape, that whatever was out there is still waiting, still watching, just beyond the edge of the light. It was the second night when we noticed the black tent. We'd set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the kind of place that felt secluded enough to be an adventure, but not so remote as to invite trouble. The first day had been perfect, clear skies, laughter echoing through the woods, and the comforting crackle of a campfire at night. But by the second evening things had shifted. I was the first to see it. The fire had burned low, and the others were huddled in their chairs, half drunk on cheap beer and the kind of tiredness that comes from a day spent outdoors. I'd stepped away to relieve myself in the bushes when I noticed it. A black tent, pitched just at the edge of our clearing, barely visible in the dim twilight. It hadn't been there before. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at it. The tent was small, the kind backpackers might carry, with taut, precise lines that suggested it had been set up with care, but there was something off about it. The fabric seemed darker than it should have been, not just black, but jet black, like it absorbed the light around it. It made the trees behind it seem to blur and fade, like a photograph smudged at the edges. When I returned to the group, I pointed it out. We all turned to look, squinting into the growing darkness, and a chill settled over the campsite. Someone muttered something about another camper joining us, but no one seemed entirely convinced. We hadn't heard anyone approach, and the forest was the kind of quiet that amplified every sound. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Surely we would have noticed. Still, we told ourselves it was nothing. Another camper, maybe someone shy or keeping to themselves. It wasn't that unusual, was it? And yet, as the night wore on, the tent remained silent. No one emerged to join us by the fire, or even to light their own. It just sat there, its unnatural blackness standing out against the soft greys and greens of the forest, like a blemish on the landscape. Eventually, curiosity got the better of us. Armed with torches and a mix of bravado and unease, we approached it. The closer we got, the colder the air seemed to grow. Not the crisp chill of the night, but something deeper. More profound. It felt like the kind of cold that settles in your bones, that makes your skin crawl. When we reached the tent, we hesitated. The flap hung loose, swaying slightly in a breeze we couldn't feel. I crouched down and peered inside, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the others behind me. It was empty. No sleeping bag, no gear, no sign that anyone had ever been inside. Just an empty, yawning space that felt much larger than it should have been. The light from my torch seemed to bend and dim as it hit the interior, refusing to illuminate it properly. It was like staring into a void. We backed away quickly, returning to the fire with a shared, unspoken agreement not to talk about it. The tent wasn't ours, and whatever it wasn't our problem. We let the fire die down and crawled into our sleeping bags, the unease settling over us like a second layer of night. I didn't sleep well. I doubt any of us did. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't before, the usual rustles and whispers of the woods replaced by an oppressive, watching silence. I kept expecting to hear footsteps, the zip of a tent being opened, something, but the night remained still. When dawn finally broke, the first thing I noticed was the absence of the black tent. It was simply gone, no sign of where it had been, no indentation in the ground, no scuffed earth. It was as though it had never been there at all. And then we noticed that Sarah was missing. Her tent was unzipped, the sleeping bag inside empty. At first we thought she'd gone for a walk or stepped away for a moment, but as the minutes stretched into hours, the reality began to sink in. Her pack was still there, her boots, even her phone. She hadn't just wandered off, she'd vanished. We searched, of course, called her name until our voices were hoarse, combed through the woods until the sun was high in the sky, but there was no sign of her, no footprints, no trail, nothing. It was like she'd been plucked from existence. As we packed up to leave, the forest seemed to press in around us, darker and denser than before. The trees loomed like silent witnesses, their branches heavy with secrets they would never share. Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been trespassing on something we were never meant to see. And sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still picture that black tent at the edge of the clearing. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. The first night was fine, peaceful even. The kind of crisp, clean air that makes you forget about the world for a little while when all you want is to sit by the fire and stare into the flames. The kind of night you imagine when you think of camping, before everything falls apart. We'd heard the stories, of course, everyone has. The old forest that nobody dares to visit unless they're foolish or desperate. The place where shadows linger longer than they should, where the trees seem to breathe and whisper to each other when the wind dies down. The locals don't speak of it much, but when they do it with their eyes down, in hushed voices. Haunted, they say. The kind of haunted that doesn't just stay in the dark corners of your mind. No, this kind of haunted seeps into the very soil beneath your feet. I didn't believe it, of course, not at first, neither did the others, Carly, Tom, Jamie and Greg. It was supposed to be a break from the usual, a getaway. To get away from work, from the noise, from all the things that gnawed at the edges of our lives. So we ignored the warnings, the stories about missing hikers, the strange disappearances. Who didn't hear a twig snap in the woods at night? And what did it matter? A few footsteps in the distance couldn't harm you, right? The first night was fine, the second was odd. It started with a noise, a snap of a twig far off in the trees, so faint we almost didn't hear it, but we did. It was subtle, but it wasn't the wind. The forest had gone still by then, the fire crackling lazily in front of us. It was the kind of silence that always feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. None of us said anything, not at first. You don't want to be the one to mention it, not when the others are all pretending not to notice. But it wasn't long before we all heard it. The crack of something heavy moving through the underbrush just outside the light of our campfire, too far to see, but close enough to make the hairs on the back of your neck rise. Just an animal, I told myself, just a deer or a fox. But when the night deepened and the wind didn't pick up and the sound came again, closer this time, I wasn't so sure. We stayed up late that night. The fire was low, but none of us dared to sleep. I think we all felt it, the presence, that unnerving weight in the air. The crack of the twigs grew louder as the night went on, more distinct, as if something was circling us. But when morning came, we laughed it off, like you do when you're tired, when you need to reassure yourself that nothing's wrong. The day was warm, and we spent it exploring the forest, but the shadow of the previous night lingered, always at the edges of my thoughts. By the third night, the noise was closer still, too close. It started as the snap of twigs again, but now it was joined by something else, something soft and slow, like the drag of feet across the ground, like something was moving deliberately, testing the space between us. At first we told ourselves it was just an animal, a bear maybe, or something bigger. But as the hours passed and the noises didn't stop, that excuse wore thin. Every time the wind stilled, there it was again, right at the edge of our hearing. And still we stayed in the firelight, unwilling to admit that something was wrong, something was out there. Then, on the fourth night, it happened. We sat around the dying embers, too tired to talk, but too scared to sleep. The twigs were snapping again, closer than ever before, and this time, we couldn't ignore it. Something was out there, something big, but it wasn't the sound of an animal moving through the forest. It was something deliberate, something with a purpose. And then, the silence. We hadn't realized it at first. It's the kind of silence that creeps up on you, the kind you only notice when it's gone. When all the other sounds, the wind, the birds, the rustling leaves, stopped dead. It was like the world had held its breath and forgotten how to exhale. None of us moved. We didn't even look at each other. We couldn't. We were waiting for the next sound, but it never came. It just stayed there, hanging in the air, suffocating the camp. And then we heard it, the softest of whispers, just beyond our hearing, like someone or something calling our names. I don't know how long we sat there, each of us frozen, paralyzed by some primal fear that we couldn't name. But then it was over. The night rolled back, the wind began to blow again, and the sound of twigs snapping returned. Fainter this time, distant, as though whatever had been out there had moved away. We breathed a collective sigh of relief, like we had all been holding our breath, and for a moment I thought we'd make it through the night. But then the real horror came. We woke to find Greg gone, no sign of him, his sleeping bag empty, no traces of footprints in the dirt, nothing, like he'd simply vanished. We called for him, of course. We searched the woods all morning, but there was no trace, no sign of a struggle, no blood, just the empty space where he'd been and the knowledge that something or someone had taken him. We left the forest that day, running, terrified and never looking back. But when we spoke to the locals, they didn't seem surprised. They said the forest has a way of taking what it wants and you're never really safe once it's noticed you. They also said one more thing, that when the forest takes you, it doesn't always take you entirely. Sometimes it leaves something behind. Something that looks like you but isn't. Something that waits patiently for the next group of friends to wander too close. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or curses, but I know this. When the wind shifts just right, I can hear twigs snapping in the distance. And I'll swear every time that it's getting closer. The thing about paths is that they always lead somewhere, even if you don't know where. And that's what makes them dangerous, because sometimes they don't want to be found. We'd been hiking for hours, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting everything in that dim amber glow that always feels like a warning. My family and I were out camping in the woods, just the four of us, trying to escape the noise of the world. But the woods, well, the woods have their own noise, don't they? The creak of branches, the whisper of the wind, the faint rustling of creatures in the underbrush. We'd followed a trail for most of the day, a well-worn path that had been mapped out, a route that felt safe. But as we came to the edge of the clearing, there it was, an unmarked trail, hidden almost, as if it were ashamed to be seen. It was narrower than the main trail, the trees pressing in closer, and the ground was thick with undergrowth. There was something odd about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up even before we stepped onto it. Of course, that didn't stop us. I didn't speak of the unease. I never do. But I could feel it, thick in the air like the calm before a storm. My wife, Emma, was already walking ahead, her curiosity tugging at her. And the kids, oblivious as always, followed without question. So we stepped onto the path, drawn by something neither of us could name. The deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The forest seemed to press in on us, the trees crowding the trail, blocking out the fading light. And then I saw it. Bone, animal bone, scattered across the path like broken toys. Bits of skulls, ribs, fragments of things once living, now nothing more than remnants. It was wrong. So very wrong. We'd seen deer tracks before and a rabbit's discarded remains here and there. But this was something else. I didn't say anything, not at first. I thought maybe it was just the natural course of things. A coyote's kill, perhaps, or some predator who had been feasting in the woods, but there were too many bones, too many scattered across the ground in odd, unsettling piles. The further we walked, the more there were, and the smell, it was faint at first, a faint acrid tang, but it grew stronger, like something rotting just out of sight. At one point, I stopped. Something made me stop. The hairs on my arms prickled, the feeling of being watched. I looked around, trying to shake off the thought, but the woods had gone still. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just that eerie silence. And then I saw it, a glimmer of movement between the trees, a flash of grey, like a shadow stalking just out of reach. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. I mean, that happens, doesn't it? Your mind works overtime in the quiet, especially when you're out in the woods. But then I heard it. A sound, soft at first, almost imperceptible. Like a footfall on dry leaves, I turned, but saw nothing but the thickening gloom, the trail ahead, and the bone-strewn earth beneath my feet. I took a step forward, hoping it would pass, but my body was already on edge, every nerve screaming at me to turn back, to leave, to run, but there was no turning back, not now. And then the sound came again, closer this time, unmistakable. Footsteps in the underbrush, deliberate and slow. I wanted to call out to Emma to warn her, but my voice caught in my throat. The sound came from all around now, from the trees, from behind the rocks, from the very ground we walked upon. I could feel it closing in, like the forest itself was alive, moving, shifting, watching us. I told myself it was just the wind, but I knew it wasn't. I knew we weren't alone. The bones had started to gather in piles now, almost as if they were being placed there deliberately, arranged in grotesque patterns. There were eyes. No, not eyes, just sockets, looking out at us from the darkness, empty and yet full of something ancient, something hungry. A part of me wanted to run, another part wanted to look back to make sure Emma and the kids were still behind me, but I couldn't move, couldn't think, only feel. And then I saw it. The thing in the woods. It wasn't big, but it was fast, a blur in the corner of my vision, a shadow low to the ground, moving like liquid, weaving between the trees with terrifying speed. Its eyes glinted red like coals in a dying fire, and I could feel its gaze on me, cold and hungry. I didn't know what it was, I didn't care. All I knew was that we were being hunted. I turned, ran, and didn't look back. I couldn't. The path was wrong, and whatever was following us had no intention of letting us leave. We ran, and we ran, but the woods only seemed to grow thicker, the path more twisted until I couldn't tell which way was which. And through it all, the bone-chilling laughter echoed in the distance, the sound of something that had been waiting for us. I don't know how we made it out, or if we really did, but the woods aren't the same now. The air is heavy, and every shadow feels like something waiting. I will never walk that path again. No one should. But the thing about paths is that they always lead somewhere, and sometimes they don't want to be found. There's a kind of silence that settles in a forest, thick and heavy, like it's pressing against your chest. You get used to it, eventually. You stop hearing the things that should be there, the rustling of leaves, the scurry of animals, the creaking of the trees. And when that happens, you start hearing the things that shouldn't be there. We had been hiking for days, deep into the forest, further than we had planned. But the promise of solitude, of a place untouched, had been too tempting. No roads, no distractions, no signs of civilization, just us and the forest, or so we thought, just the way we liked it. We pitched our tents at the edge of a clearing close enough to the stream to hear the gentle gurgle of water, far enough from the trail to feel like we had the whole wilderness to ourselves. The first night was uneventful, a few strange noises here and there, distant calls, the snap of a twig, but nothing that would make anyone uneasy. But then, just after midnight, we heard it. The radio crackled to life, sharp and sudden, cutting through the stillness. A burst of static, followed by a distorted clicking sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the static you get from bad reception, the kind that fades in and out. No, this was something different, like a series of deliberate noises, an alien rhythm. At first I thought it was just the wind or something. The trees could mess with signals, couldn't they? Or maybe a radio malfunction. But it didn't feel like that. I wasn't the only one who noticed. We all looked up from our spots around the fire, our faces lit by the orange glow. But no one said anything. You don't say anything when you don't know what to say. You just listen. The sound was almost musical, in a way, high-pitched clicks that followed a pattern, rhythmic, repetitive. Then a low hum, like the sound of a far-off engine. It was all we could hear, the night's peace, shattered by the strange communication. I stared at the radio, willing it to stop, to go back to the silence. But it didn't. Instead, the clicks grew more frantic, more intense, as if it were trying to say something. I stood up and walked toward the radio, half expecting it to cut off any second, but it didn't. It just kept going. Click, click. Buzz, the frequency shifting like it was being fine-tuned. My fingers trembled as I turned the dial, desperate to make it stop, but nothing happened. The clicking continued, louder now, and the air around us seemed to hum with it as though the very space was alive, vibrating. It felt like the radio wasn't just picking up a signal, it felt like the signal was picking us up. That's when I realized this wasn't static, this wasn't interference, it was something else. I can't explain why I didn't just turn the damn thing off and bury it in the dirt. Maybe I was too curious, or maybe the sound had already burrowed into my brain and I couldn't look away, but I kept listening, as if waiting for something more. The clicking stopped, and for a moment I thought it had all been a trick of the wind, a passing disturbance in the air. But then the radio emitted a deep, guttural hum, low, almost felt in the chest, vibrating through the air like a heartbeat. The radio crackled once more, and then I heard it. A voice. Not a voice like a human voice, not even a whisper. It was like something trying to communicate, but using a language that had no shape, no rhythm we understood. It was all noise. Loud, abrasive noise, like the screech of nails on glass, followed by a low, throbbing sound, deep and suffocating. That was when we knew. It wasn't just a radio malfunction. It wasn't just static or interference. The forest wasn't alone. It had never been alone. I watched the others, 3 of them, sitting frozen around the fire, their faces pale, their eyes wide. No one spoke. No one moved. We were all caught in the grip of the sound, drawn to it, listening as it grew louder, more insistent. The voice was talking to us. I could feel it in my bones. It was trying to reach us, to get through to us, and I wasn't sure if we should be afraid or if we should be curious. The clicking returned, now urgent, sharp like a warning. Each click felt like it was pressing into my skull, reverberating through me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of silence that's wrong, unnatural, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. And then we heard it. A sound from the trees, just beyond the clearing, a low, rasping breath, then another, closer this time. It was like something moving, something watching us, a heavy presence breathing in the darkness. The air was thick with it, too thick to breathe properly. I don't know how long we stayed there, staring at the trees, the radio silent now, too long maybe, long enough for the last trace of the hum to sink into our minds, to settle there like a tumor. But eventually we got up, grabbed our things and started packing. The noise from the radio had stopped, but it didn't matter. We knew what it was now. It wasn't just a sound, it was a warning. It was something watching us from the dark. By the time we reached the trail, the forest had gone still again, unnervingly so. There were no birds, no wind. It was just the sound of our footsteps, too loud in the silence. We never spoke of it again. We never even looked back. But I know what I heard. And I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, listening. The worst part is I'm not sure it was ever trying to communicate with us. Maybe it was just telling us we were in the way. Maybe it was just reminding us that we were never meant to be there, that we had already crossed a line we shouldn't have crossed. And now I can't help but wonder if that voice, the clicking, the hum, wasn't the forest speaking to us at all. What if it was something else? Something beyond the trees, beyond the mountains, something that had been waiting for us to listen. I hear the clicks sometimes, even now. At night, in the quiet of my room, when everything is still, just a faint clicking sound growing louder in the dark. Maybe it's just in my head. Maybe. But I don't think so. I didn't see him arrive, not at first, not until it was too late. The thing is, you don't expect a stranger to slip into a group of 10 people and blend in so seamlessly. But that's exactly what happened. We'd been out there for days, deep in the woods, far away from any real roads. A weekend trip, planned at the last minute with friends I'd known for years, good people, the kind of group that felt invincible by the firelight. The crackling of the logs, the smell of burnt marshmallows, the hum of idle conversation, everything felt safe. It always does when you're sitting around a campfire in the woods. But when the man appeared, I didn't notice at first. No one did. He just was there. One moment we were all laughing, joking, tossing a football around in the darkness. The next, there was a man sitting among us, tall, thin, wearing a weathered jacket. His clothes were nondescript, the kind you'd find at any second-hand shop. The colors faded like they'd seen too much sun. His face wasn't right. But no one said anything. No one looked at him twice. It's odd, isn't it, how easily you can forget to question things, how easily your mind will smooth over the impossible. The others didn't notice it either. Not at first. It was like he had always been there, like he belonged, like he'd been sitting in that circle of laughter and light the whole time. He didn't speak, not yet, but his presence didn't seem odd to anyone else, not to Sarah, not to Ben, not to any of us. And that's the thing. In the moment, you don't realize how strange it is. He had somehow slipped in without anyone noticing. You don't question the little things in life, not until they've slipped so far past the point of no return. It wasn't until the fire crackled one last time and the wind kicked up, sending sparks into the air, that the real terror began. I saw the others start to look at him, really look at him, and that's when it hit me. I didn't recognize him. None of us did. He hadn't arrived with us. Not at all. I'd been watching, paying attention, and I knew for sure that no one had approached the camp. No one had arrived. But now, as the firelight flickered, casting long shadows over his face, it was like the world stood still. The other faces around the fire grew stiff, eyes widening. They felt it too, the same shiver that crawled up my spine. He wasn't one of us. But before anyone could say anything, before we could make sense of it, the man stood up, jerking so suddenly that his jacket flapped wide and caught the wind. His eyes weren't just wide now, they were wild. He looked at us, his gaze darting from face to face, and for a split second I saw something flicker in them. Something dark, something wrong. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he started screaming. It wasn't a human scream, not really. It was guttural, raw, full of madness. He lurched forward, hands outstretched, knocking over the tin plates, the leftover food, the mugs, everything in his path, until the camp was a mess of smashed metal and scattered trash. The fire flared up, sending heat into our faces, and for a moment I couldn't make sense of it. What was happening? The man's movements were jerky, chaotic, like he wasn't in control of his own body. He was thrashing around the camp, knocking over tents, kicking the cooler across the ground. His face twisted into something that looked like pain, or maybe rage, but I didn't know which. His hands reached for anything he could destroy, his fingers clawing at the air, ripping apart whatever he could. We didn't move. We didn't know what to do. We couldn't comprehend it. It was as if everything we knew about this world, about reality, had been turned on its head. I couldn't even hear my heart pounding over the sound of him, over the chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, he stopped. He froze, standing in the middle of the mess he'd created. His breathing was heavy, uneven. Sweat glistened on his forehead. He looked at us, but this time it was different. It was like he saw us for the first time. His eyes cleared for a moment, and it seemed like recognition flickered in them, but that moment didn't last long. The terror, the madness came back in full force. He screamed again, but this time it was a noise of pure, unbridled fear. And before anyone could react, he turned and ran, sprinting into the dark woods, vanishing into the shadows as though he were being swallowed whole by the trees. We didn't follow him. We couldn't. No one spoke for what felt like forever. The fire now reduced to little more than embers, casting an eerie glow on our faces. What had just happened? Who was he? How had he come to be here? There was no answer. There was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, like the forest itself was trying to whisper something we weren't meant to hear. It was then that I realized something else, something that had been gnawing at the edge of my mind. We hadn't heard any footsteps when he ran into the woods. No crunch of twigs, no rustling leaves, just the sound of his frantic breathing, and then nothing. The woods were silent again. I don't know why I stayed that night. Maybe I was afraid to leave, afraid of what would happen if we packed up and left, if we let that thing out there in the dark. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the man who had left. Something else had followed him, something that wasn't quite human. And even now, long after that night, I feel it sometimes, a presence, just on the edge of my sight, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting, as though it never really left. None of us spoke of that night again, not after we packed up and left, but sometimes when I close my eyes I can still hear the crackling of the fire, the chaos of the campsite being torn apart, and the man's scream echoing through the trees. And I know, deep down, that he wasn't the only thing that came out of those woods that night. The first scream came just after midnight. It sliced through the stillness like a blade, sharp and shrill, echoing through the blackness of the woods. We froze around the campfire, the laughter dying in our throats, replaced by a cold, creeping silence. At first I thought it was an animal, a fox perhaps, or some bird with a call that carried too much weight in the night. But deep down, even then, I knew. No animal makes a sound like that. The firelight flickered weakly against the dark, casting long, shivering shadows that danced like phantoms. No one said anything. We didn't need to. The sound was enough to unnerve even the most skeptical among us. It was a scream, unmistakably human, but warped somehow. It was raw, guttural, and filled with a terror so primal it felt contagious. It sounded like someone dying, or worse, someone begging not to. It stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the sound of the crackling fire and the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. We stayed up for hours after, too uneasy to sleep, our eyes darting towards the dark woods that loomed just beyond the edge of the light. Nothing stirred out there, but that didn't make it feel any safer. The next night, the scream came again, this time closer. We were still awake when it happened, and the sound made my skin crawl. It came from somewhere to the east, just beyond the line of trees where the moonlight couldn't quite reach. It was longer this time, more drawn out, and filled with a kind of desperate agony that twisted my stomach into knots. I could see the others flinch, could feel the unspoken fear settling in the air like a thick fog. Against my better judgment, a few of us grabbed torches and ventured into the woods. We didn't go far, just far enough to see the dense trees swallow up the light from our campfire. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that felt wrong. No crickets chirping, no rustling leaves, no night birds calling, just silence. It felt like we were trespassing on something ancient and angry. We found nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no sign of anything that could have made such a sound. By the time we got back to camp, my nerves were shot. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think any of us did. The third night, the screams started earlier. It was still evening, the fire blazing bright when the first one ripped through the air. It came from the west this time, from deeper in the woods. We all jumped, our heads snapping in the direction of the sound. This scream was different, louder, closer. It had a wet, gurgling edge to it, like something choking on its own blood. It was worse than before, more visceral, more real. I wanted to leave then and there, but no one said it out loud. Maybe we didn't want to admit we were scared. Maybe we thought the woods would laugh at us if we ran. But that night, the screams didn't stop. They came again and again from different directions, circling the camp like some invisible predator. Every time one echoed through the trees, it felt closer, as though whatever was out there was tightening a noose around us. The firelight suddenly felt fragile, useless against the vast, oppressive dark that surrounded us. And then, just after midnight, the screams came from inside the camp. The sound erupted behind me, so close it felt like someone had screamed directly into my ear. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The fire crackled weakly, the shadows shifting and swaying, but the campsite was empty, save for us. The others looked as pale and shaken as I felt. Another scream came, this time from the opposite side of the camp. It was the same, loud, piercing, filled with unearthly terror, but it had no source. The sound was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Panic set in. We grabbed what we could and ran, stumbling through the dark, tripping over roots and rocks as the screams followed us. They echoed in every direction, growing louder, more frantic, until it felt like the forest itself was alive and angry. I don't know how long we ran, but it felt like hours. When we finally reached the safety of our cars, gasping for breath and covered in scratches from the underbrush, the screams stopped. The silence was almost worse. It pressed against my ears, heavy and unnatural, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. We didn't stay to find out what. Even now I can still hear those screams sometimes in the dead of night when everything else is quiet. I hear them in my dreams, in the back of my mind, and I wonder if we left something behind in those woods or if it followed us out. The cabin looked like it had been waiting for us. We'd been lost for hours, the daylight thinning into a sickly grey that seeped through the dense canopy of trees overhead. The trail we'd been following had vanished into the undergrowth, and with it, any hope of finding our way back before nightfall. The woods were endless, oppressive, and alive with the kind of quiet that makes you feel unwelcome. Then we saw it, standing there among the pines like a secret revealed too late. A cabin, its wooden walls weathered and grey, crouched beneath the looming trees. The roof sagged under a blanket of moss, and the windows, dark and empty, stared out like blind eyes. It shouldn't have been there, not this far out, not in the middle of nowhere. But it was, and we were too tired and desperate to question it. The door creaked open under the weight of my hand, and a rush of stale, damp air greeted us. The inside was even worse than I'd expected. Dust coated every surface, disturbed only by the faint scuttling of something small and unseen. A table stood in the center of the room, its surface scarred and stained, surrounded by mismatched chairs. In the corner, a fireplace yawned black and empty, its hearth littered with ash that looked fresher than it should have been. It was the journals that made my stomach turn. They were piled haphazardly on the table, their covers cracked and faded, their pages yellowed with age. I picked one up, its leather binding soft and greasy under my fingers, and began to flip through it. The handwriting was shaky, the words scrawled in a frantic, uneven script. It was a diary, a record of someone who had stayed here before us. The first entries were mundane, notes about the weather, the forest, the cabin itself. But as I read on, the tone shifted. The writer began to speak of a presence, of hearing footsteps outside the cabin at night, of seeing shadows that didn't belong. The final entry was short, just 3 words scrawled across the page in a jagged hand. He found me. I set the journal down, my hands shaking, and reached for another. This one was worse. It described the same pattern. Arriving at the cabin, noticing small, strange things, and then the overwhelming sense of being watched. The last entry was smeared with something dark, its words barely legible. There were more journals than I could count, each telling the same story, each ending abruptly. None of the writers had left the cabin alive. My skin prickled as I realized the truth. This wasn't an abandoned shelter, it was a trap. Someone or something was using it to lure people in, to make them disappear. And then we heard the sound. The door creaked, slow and deliberate, as though it were being pushed open by an unseen hand. The floorboards groaned under a heavy weight, and a shadow stretched across the threshold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stepped inside, tall and hulking, its face obscured by the gloom. And then it turned its head towards us. We ran. The cabin seemed to tilt and shift as we bolted through the doorway, the dark woods swallowing us whole. Branches clawed at my face, my legs burned with exertion, but I didn't dare stop. Behind us I could hear the heavy thud of footsteps, faster and closer than they should have been. My lungs screamed for air, my vision blurred, but the fear was stronger than the pain. We didn't know where we were going, only that we had to keep moving, keep putting distance between us and the thing that had found us. Somehow we stumbled upon the ranger's hut. It stood small and unassuming, a beacon of light in the endless dark. We burst inside, collapsing onto the floor, our words tumbling over each other as we tried to explain what we'd seen. The ranger listened, his face pale and unreadable, and radioed for help. When they found the cabin, it was exactly as we'd described. The journals, the scarred table, the ash in the fireplace, it was all there, but the killer, the one who had entered that cabin and chased us through the woods, was nowhere to be found. They searched for weeks, combing the forest, but they never found him, or it, whatever it was. And now, even safe at home, I can't close my eyes without seeing that cabin, without hearing the scrape of the door or the weight of those footsteps behind me. I know it's still out there, waiting for the next lost soul to stumble across it, waiting for its next story to be written. I've never been afraid of the woods. I grew up in them, spent my childhood exploring their endless twists and turns. There's a rhythm to nature that I understood. Birds calling, leaves rustling, the quiet hum of life. It wasn't until I went out on my own, far from the safety of familiar paths, that I realized how little I truly understood. I set up camp at the edge of the forest, the kind of place most people would have driven past without a second thought. A ridge with a view over the valley. Perfect for a bit of solitude, or so I thought. I was used to camping alone, comfortable with the stillness of it all. The fire crackled softly beside me. The stars above seemed a little too bright, but nothing out of the ordinary. I slept well that first night, no sounds beyond the usual, the whisper of wind through the trees, the occasional call of a nocturnal animal. But when I woke the next night, I knew something was wrong. It started with the figure, a shape dark against the starlit sky, standing on the ridge. I first saw it as I stirred in my sleeping bag, waking from a restless slumber. The fire had burned low, and the world beyond it was shrouded in shadow. I could barely make out the figure, tall, thin, unmoving, but it was there, staring down at me. I'd heard of people seeing things in the dark, of minds playing tricks in isolation, but I couldn't shake the cold chill that crept up my spine. I turned away, telling myself it was nothing, a trick of the night, a branch maybe, or a shadow cast by the fire. But when I looked back, it was still there, watching. The stillness of it was unnerving. It wasn't like a person watching you, it was like something more ancient, more patient. I spent the rest of the night staring into the dark, pretending to sleep, watching for any movement. But the figure didn't move, it just stood there, as though time meant nothing to it. The next night I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a large bird standing still on the ridge. It wasn't until I woke again, just past midnight, that I saw it again, but this time it was closer, much closer. I couldn't see any details, not really, but I could feel its presence, like the air was thicker around it. It was no longer on the ridge. Now it stood just outside the reach of my firelight, watching me. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence was unbearable. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't. There was something in the air, something that made my throat feel tight. I wanted to move, to stand up, but my legs were frozen in place. I felt a kind of paralysis, a weight that pressed down on me. The figure didn't move, not a step, not a sound, but I knew deep down that it was watching me, watching every breath I took, every flicker of movement in my eyes. In the morning, I packed up my things quickly. I figured I'd just had a bad night, a product of too much solitude, too much stillness. I would drive away, find somewhere else to camp, and forget the strange feeling that had clung to me. But as I stepped out into the sunlight, I felt something cold again, a presence. I glanced up at the ridge, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw something move just out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked properly, the ridge was empty. I told myself I was being stupid. I'd just been spooked by a bad night of sleep. But then, that night, it happened again. The figure standing on the ridge, exactly where it had been the first night, still, unmoving, watching. But this time I didn't wait for the terror to creep up slowly. I recognized it for what it was. It was not an animal, not a trick of the mind. It was something else, something that had no right to be there. I couldn't stay another night. I grabbed my gear and packed up in a hurry, but as I moved to leave, something froze me. The figure was no longer on the ridge. It was behind me. I don't know how it happened. One moment I'd been staring at the ridge, watching the silhouette of something too tall, too unnatural to be human. And the next it was right there at the edge of my vision, standing just out of the firelight where I hadn't seen it approach. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't look directly at it, I couldn't, but I knew it was following me. I moved faster, but so did it. I would hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, and then it would be silent again. I'd hear the soft drag of fabric, the faintest sound of something moving, like a step taken just before I noticed. Every time I stopped to listen, it stopped too, waiting, watching. It wasn't until I reached the truck, trembling, my hands fumbling with the keys, that I dared to look behind me. The trees, the ridge, everything was still, but I felt it. I felt its presence, like a shadow just beyond my line of sight. I got into the truck, started the engine and drove. I didn't stop to look back. It's been days now, and I've tried to forget it. I've told myself that it was just some hallucination brought on by isolation, that maybe my mind played tricks on me. But when I close my eyes at night, I see it again, that figure standing on the ridge. And I know it wasn't just a trick, because no matter how fast I run, no matter how far I go, it follows. It's always waiting, watching. I can feel it even now, just behind me, just out of sight.